Welcome to Worlds Apart. The Westminster Bridge attack in London followed a familiar terrorist script with a few new twists. The attacker was older, the vehicle was smaller, and the outcry was more subdued. Are we getting used to the banality of terror? Well, to discuss that, I'm now joined by Tahir Abbas, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Mr. Abbas, it's great to have you on the show, and let me start with expressing our sympathies and condolences to anyone in London and beyond who's been affected by this tragedy.
Well, thank you for having me, and I share those your feelings and sentiments with regards to those condolences. It's a tough time, but we will get through it.
It is already the third time in less than a year that a vehicle has been deliberately driven into a crowd of people in a major European city, and the credit for the attack claimed by major terrorist organizations. I don't want to sound callous, but it looks like the terrorists may have found their ideal method that allows them to get the maximum exposure with the minimum of efforts.
Well, what's happened here is that over the last 10 years or so, particularly in Britain, we've improved our understanding and learning in relation to counterterrorism measures. And so it is almost impossible to carry out the very technological, sophisticated attack. And what is left is a very simple approach. It's not necessarily new to Islamic State-inspired acts, but it has been done over many years, and it's the most simplest thing to do, and it's the most difficult to protect against.
Absolutely, and I know that after the December attack in Berlin, you, among other people, advocated the creation of anti-ramming barriers around the places with large concentration of people. And from what I know, that advice was followed. There is such barrier around Westminster Palace. But as you just pointed out, making it more difficult for terrorists to perpetrate a high-tech attack may actually make people more vulnerable, more people more vulnerable.
Well, there is the impact of having to push these terrorists away from what they would regard as more complex plots and attacks to to stop them from doing that, which means that they will be drawn to the very simple and the very easy, following the diktats presented by various individuals out of Islamic State and other related groups.
Now, what struck me in this particular case is the age of the assailant, because the attackers in Nice and in Berlin were much younger, in their late 20s, early 30s, but this one was 52 years old, not exactly an age prone to radicalization, or at least this is not how we think about it. I wondered whether that's going to change our perspective on the terrorist recruitment pool, which is usually described as angry young men.
Well, he's certainly angry. He may not have been young, but he was angry. And so the mechanisms, the pathways that have led to this individual's radicalization are not too dissimilar from those experienced by young men, as it were. So we have to still look at the pathways, we have to look at the trigger points, we have to look at where these people enter into the realm of violent extremism and what makes that happen and how we can stop that.
If you look at what the London police have said so far, they noted that he had previous criminal convictions for crimes that have nothing to do with radicalization or extremism. They also said that there were no indications that he may turn radical. So how exactly can we look for, motivating factors here? Because it looks like everybody can essentially be radicalized in a very short period of time.
Well, that would be slightly problematic. It would suggest that anybody is vulnerable. Anybody who's angry, alienated, and isolated is vulnerable to extremism. What it does suggest is that these triggers, these points at which people enter into the pathway towards violent extremism, affects a lot of people, but not everybody chooses to go all the way to extremism and violence. They can be angry, they can be agitated, and so on, but they don't necessarily become violent or aggressive, and in this case, terrorists.
Now, media certainly can be part of triggering that kind of response, and I know that there is a lot of discussion in the British media about how to approach these kinds of terrorist attacks and how to frame them, whether to present it as an attack by an individual, albeit under the influence of a malicious ideology, or to present it as a terrorist organization striking at the heart of London in this case. How do you see it?
Well, terrorism is effectively about the impact of the act. It's there to create fear. But if we use the opportunity to constantly discuss it and constantly expand on the ideas, it does the job of the terrorists if we're not careful. And I think this is an argument that has been well stated in relation to this Westminster attacker over the last 2 or 3 days, that part of the problem is the constant hype about terrorism, about extremism, about Muslim minority issues.
Well, I wonder, though, if politicians are lending a helping hand, too, because, for example, Prime Minister Theresa May described this act of terrorism as, and I'm quoting her here, an attack on free people everywhere that tried to silence our democracy. And to me, that not only sounds a lot like a quote from George W. Bush, but what I think is far more important is that it actually confirms the ISIS claim that it was indeed a crime not by a deranged individual, but by a major terrorist group. What do you think about that? Don't you think that such political statements are actually playing into ISIS' hands?
Well, there is an argument to be made that such kind of statements definitely support the rhetoric of Islamic State and other similar organizations, which argue the point that you have a legitimate right and even a duty to react, and in this case in your own home countries, rather than join the Islamic State efforts in Iraq or Syria. So if politicians are not careful, they can potentially feed into this rhetoric without knowing it. What we say about these things is as important as what we do about these issues.
Absolutely, but again, Theresa May's statement on the surface of it has nothing particularly radicalizing about it. But what strikes me here is that groups like ISIS want to present their struggle as this, holy war, as a civilizational struggle. And when somebody like Mrs. May says that it's an attack on free people everywhere, she gives it a symbolic meaning. She gives it a lot of symbolism that, in my view, terrorists can easily take, repackage in their own terms, and inflate their own significance. Why do you think both the politicians and perhaps the terror groups are interested in making this, again, turning this issue into a symbolic issue rather than an incident or an attack that was perpetrated by an individual?
Some of this is clearly political, but there is also a legacy, the war on terror legacy, where the immediate responses were very aggressive, were very much designed in the light of a sense that there is an Islamic takfiri, jihadist element that needs to be eliminated. And in support of that, we as a Western set of nations have the freedoms, democracies and liberties that they do not want, and so it's presenting a kind of oppositional dynamic, partly to suggest also that there is cohesion, there is a notion of national identity that keeps us together at times of crisis, but it's all about interpretation.
Absolutely, it's all about interpretation, but I wonder if it's also a version of a holy war, albeit in the democratic vernacular of free world, because when you make it into, again, an attack on the whole free world or people, free people everywhere, that's what makes it so appealing for the terrorist groups. They know that even if there's some deranged individual who strikes in the middle of a city, you can portray it actually as an attack on the whole world, with the help of Prime Minister in this case.
I mean, a Prime Minister, for example, in this case, needs to show leadership. They need to show authority at a time where people are fearful, people are worried, they're concerned about their safety and security. So it's a definitive attempt to try and build a sense of cohesion, a sense of national strength in the light of what has been challenged by external threats, external agents who wish to destroy our way of life, as it were.
Well, but here again, I think you're also giving it a little bit more symbolism than it deserves, because when you recognize that, or when you suggest that this deranged person, was to destroy your own way of life, that may actually encourage more people to do just that.
Well, not necessarily. I mean, you see, in the case of the individual, the problem is that they have become sort of hypnotized by the idea of a right or wrong, a black and white, an us and them distinction, so much so that they do not wish to live this life anymore. They want to live a life beyond this life. They misinterpret versus they buy into ideology, which is, again, easy to absorb if you're psychologically, emotionally vulnerable. And so in many ways, these people need support, need help, but it often is too late.
Now, I know that you caution against making Islam, or rather the radical interpretation of Islam, the center of the story, partially because it may fuel Islamophobia, but not mentioning it at all or underplaying it may have the exact same effect. And I think we've seen that already in the United States when Barack Obama's unwillingness to use the phrase Islamic terrorism actually provoked quite a lot of anti-Islamic feelings among the Trump supporters. This was a specific campaign point for Trump and his supporters to accuse Barack Obama of not recognizing the actual threat. I'm not debating the veracity of the statements, but I wonder if in some way both doing that and not doing that creates the same kind of problem.
Well, it's damned if you do and damned if you don't. And this is one of those situations. But it is clear that one of the reasons why Theresa May on this occasion and Barack Obama perhaps historically would be more willing to moderate their language around this is because there is an understanding that by having such an acute approach, by using the language in a way to have sharp, defined boundaries, means that certain groups will take energy from this. So far-right groups are emboldened when politicians talk about a Muslim ban or they talk about the need to do away with Islamic extremism rather than Islamist extremism. And I think these are very important discourses in the context of how we, again, define the problem and define the solutions.
Mm-hmm. Now, in one of your articles, you made a very interesting point, in my view, on that whether it is far-right or radical Islamists, the root causes of violent extremism are more political than they're ideological, which necessarily means that radical Islamists and Islamophobes have much more in common than they care to admit. But it seems that they both will be able to score some propaganda points no matter how you structure your discourse about an attack like this. Simply by the fact of this attack occurring, they will already win.
Yes, I mean, I think that's right. And when we think about far-right extremists and Islamist extremists, they are very much the same, part of the same set of dynamics in relation to alienation, anger, frustration, feeling left behind, thinking that the state doesn't care for them. And for all of these individuals, their problems are local. But when it comes to the far-right groups, their solutions are national and local. When it comes to Islamist groups, the solutions are seen as global. So how the problem is defined is definitely a local issue. But when it comes to solutions, there are different perspectives, whether it's national or global.
Well, Mr. Abbas, we have to take a short break now, but when we come back, while most countries have sent their condolences to London, few of them agree on what terrorism is, and even less on how to fight it. Is a consensus even possible here? That's coming up in a moment on Worlds Apart. Stay tuned.
On his way from the army headquarters, Russian Emperor Nicholas II is forced to stand down from the throne. He signs the abdication and hands it over to representatives of the Russian Duma, who will officially announce the Tsar's decision later. In just 16 months, Nicholas II and his whole family will be shot.
Welcome back to Worlds Apart. We are discussing the Westminster Bridge attack with Tahir Abbas, Senior Research Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. Mr. Abbas, we have already discussed Theresa May's comments, but I thought her Foreign Secretary's statement was even more remarkable in this regard. Speaking at the United Nations, Boris Johnson said, and I'm quoting him here, "The world is united to defeat the people who launched this attack and to defeat their bankrupt and odious ideology." And I find this statement so facetious because the world is anything but united. It's actually highly divided on how to deal with terrorism. Do such platitudes, even well-intentioned platitudes, do they really help to address the issue?
It's not there to try and mollify people like the Islamic State and related groups. It's there to try and bring together the populations in the countries in the West so that they understand that there is something that brings them together at a difficult time. And yes, there's an element of politicking here, but ultimately it's more about the idea of, well, look, we've just had an attack. We need to show unity and strength in response to this. So it has to be done carefully. I totally agree with that. And it has to be done sensitively without provoking and evoking a response which sees these statements as confirmations of the idea that the West disregards or does not care for the rest of the world, and it is being artificial about how it sees itself.
But it is being artificial because it is very clear, at least to me, after having covered the wars in Libya and in Syria, that there is no unity whatsoever when it comes to who is a terrorist and who is not. And Syria is one good example. I know that you believe that one of the primary causes of radicalization is the mistreatment of Muslim communities, but it's by far not the only one. And I would argue that the British foreign policy sometimes directly contributes to radicalizing people both in the Middle East and perhaps back at home. Don't you think so?
I mean, I think many would argue that, and there would be sufficient evidence to support a lot of those claims. Victimization, dehumanization, this is what causes violence. So when there is an attack on a minority or a group has been dispossessed, lands seized, properties possessed, it means that it creates anger because there are no democratic chains of resistance. And this is what we find all over the world. We've got conflict-ridden societies in the global south. We've got issues of integration of minorities in the global north.
But what we had specifically in the case of British foreign policy is, at least in the beginning of the Syrian conflict, the United Kingdom was supportive of certain groups, non-state actors, using violence for political purposes. That, you know, I'm trying to be as neutral as I can here, but isn't it bound to provoke radicalization both at home and abroad? Because by doing that, it clearly created more space and gave groups like ISIS more resources.
Well, I mean, the emergence of ISIS is very complicated. It wasn't a direct result of Western policy interventions. Often we can think of that in general terms, but in reality, there were much more multi-layered issues going on in Iraq. Now, I think the British government and other Western governments have come to terms with past issues in terms of invasions and occupations, etc., in relation to parts of the Middle East and South Asia that have created a negative response on the part of the indigenous population. So there is greater sensitivity because there is greater understanding that these actions have a reaction which could lead to blowback.
Well, Mr. Abbas, if I may disagree with you, because they may have come to terms with the consequences of their actions in Iraq, but that certainly didn't alter their policy when it comes to Syria. And till this day, the official UK policy acquiesces to the support of certain armed groups. Now, we can argue about the moderation. You know, some of them may be more moderate than the others, but the simple fact of supporting non-state actors for political purposes, don't you think that that in itself, without even any relation to Great Britain or the United States or Russia for that matter, isn't that a major source of radicalization?
Not on its own. I mean, I think something that's gone on historically in relation to Western nations in different parts of the world throughout the 21st century and the 20th century. It's something that's done in the name of global political affairs. You support local groups in an effort to try and build resistance necessary in order to make more of an attempt in terms of regime change or re-democratization, etc. And I think these were the efforts that were perhaps less well developed than they should have been, leading to many problematic outcomes, ultimately resulting in the emergence of Islamic State.
Mm-hmm. Now, as I was preparing for this program, for this conversation with you, I noticed that you usually place a lot of emphasis on not making Islam part of the story. You sort of try to make an argument that Islam is the first thing that comes to people's minds without necessarily understanding what Islam is and how, in any given case, it influenced the situation on the ground. But when it comes to Syria, what I think was very interesting is that the rebellion from the very beginning was Islamist driven. There were very, very few armed secular groups on the ground, and yet for the first few years, Islam never came into the picture. The rebellion was primarily portrayed as the struggle between democratic forces and tyranny. If media are so quick, as you complain, to draw this link between Islam and negative events, why weren't they so quick, and why weren't they so slow in the particular case of Syria?
Well, again, you see, you mentioned that earlier on, that in the case of Syria, there are so many international players, there's so many local players, and it's a proxy for so many different other regional conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia, between Turkey and the Kurdish groups in Syria, between Russia, the US, and Western Europe. So Syria has become this sort of hotbed of activity because all these other interests are being played out at the same time. And then once they become uncontrollable or they become out of hand, then we perhaps need to change the language and also the rhetoric around it.
Okay, I was just wondering why Islam never came into the picture until it was too late, because many people in the West were surprised with the power, with the influence that the Islamic State accumulated, but that certainly didn't happen over the night. And many of the signals, I would at least claim, were there in the very early years of this conflict, and yet there seemed to be a willingness on the part of the media, at least, and on the part of policymakers to simply overlook it. Was that perhaps because of the political correctness and this unwillingness that we discussed earlier, not to sort of make the situation even worse and antagonize some of the Muslims?
I remember in 2011 we had the Arab Spring that kicked off in practically all of the MENA countries and variously led to problematic outcomes in most places and with very little positive results to talk about in the current period. But at the time there was a great deal of hope and expectation that this is the moment that these countries are about to turn a corner. Now, the Arab Spring didn't reveal the results that most people wanted, and then when the Islamic State self-declared a caliphate in 2014, it was a complete surprise in the Western European framework. Already by 2010, there was a sense that the threat from Islamist extremism was going to be reduced. But when Islamic State organized themselves and got a lot of money, were able to fund themselves very well through all sorts of means, and declare themselves as a caliphate in the sort of Islamic scriptural sense, however warped the interpretation is, it changed the rules of the game.
Mm-hmm. Now, 6 years ago, when the conflict was still in the early stages and when the Arab Spring was only at the beginning, there was a lot of talk about the virtues of political Islam, of Islamism, and Turkey was showed or portrayed as a model of it. How much do you think that lionized image of Turkey affected the Western policy in Syria, and how much the events in Syria affected the recent trajectory in Turkey? I know you taught there for a number of years, so you certainly have a perspective on that.
Yes, I watched the Arab Spring unfold on the television screens and newspapers inside of Turkey for a period of 5 or 6 years. So Turkey's policy was very much to wait and see, because they believed that Assad would reform and hold elections and step down. That was the promise that they were given by the Syrian regime, but it quickly turned out to be not the case. By 2014, after the Kobani siege, Turkey had no choice but to come in, and once it did, it sort of changed the dynamics of the conflict in that region.
But I remember at that time it was very fashionable in Turkey to describe the Syrian president Assad in the harshest of terms. He was presented as the sort of devil incarnate. He was accused of wide-scale repressions and imprisoning people without due process. But you know that some of those problems have surfaced in Turkey as well. In fact, I think that Turkey has surprised many by the scale and by the scale of the repressions that it has been carrying on against the wide spectrum of its civil society. I understand that it's impossible to sort of condense history to one turning point, but when do you think Turkey started going off the rails, of the democratic rails, so to say?
Well, I think when we talked about Turkey as the economic miracle in 2010, that was probably its high point. After a period, there was growing authoritarianism after the 2011 elections. Then, while all the peace processes were going on, the Kurdish opening, the Alevi opening, the sense of recognition of minorities, the Greek Orthodox churches, etc., while that was going on, there was a great deal of positivity around Turkey, but the situation began to go south when, after the elections, more and more authoritarian interventions were being introduced that divided society and created lots of fissures that have ultimately become quite severe in the current period.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know that you've written a lot about the instrumentalization of Islam, and I wonder, how do you see President Erdogan in that regard? Is he somebody who's instrumentalized religion for his political purposes, or perhaps somebody who is using politics to advance his religion?
Well, it's probably the former, in the sense that what we know of our analysis of Muslim-majority countries is when there is a leader, over time, the authoritarian tendencies start to dominate. This seems to be the pattern. We've seen it in Indonesia, we've seen it in Turkey now, for sure. And this suggests that there's still a state of evolution that's needed to make sure that Islam and democracy is compatible. And while theoretically it certainly is, but we don't have many good examples to draw from.
Mm-hmm. And finally, if I may, you know that President Erdogan is now preoccupied with the April referendum. He hopes to get more executive presidential powers from that vote. And I've already mentioned that you taught for 6 years in Turkey. I'm sure you find the purges of many of its academic institutions quite troubling. Do you think President Erdogan, if he gets what he wants politically, do you think he is likely to be softer or harder on those whom he perceives as his enemies?
Well, there's the extent of the purges have been well documented, and there is a great deal of politicizing of them by President Erdogan and the leadership of the party in many respects. If the executive presidency does come through, and there is every likelihood that it will, there is a risk that this authoritarianism may take another step towards more darker and deeper periods of negativity.
Well, Mr. Abbas, I only hope that you are wrong on that particular point, but we have to leave it there. I really appreciate your perspective, and to our viewers, please share your comments on our Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook pages, and I hope to see you again, same place, same time, here on Worlds Apart.